The bullet had missed by 3 inches. Close enough to feel the heat, close enough to hear the crack split the air like God breaking a promise. Morgan Hale pressed her back against cold stone, left shoulder burning where shrapnel had kissed her, and counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. The flashlight beams swept the mining tunnel like searchlights hunting bombers over Berlin, and somewhere in the darkness above her position, boots scraped granite with the patience of men who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. 72 hours ago, she had been the hunter. Now she was underground, bleeding with 3 armed men between her and daylight. This is how it happened. The morning of day 1 arrived the way all mornings arrived in the Cascade Range. Cold and indifferent, and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't need you to notice. Morgan ran her fence line at 0500 hours, boots finding purchase on terrain that would break a city dweller's ankle, breath misting in air so clean it hurt to pull into damaged lungs. The sun was still an idea on the eastern horizon. The mountains were black silhouettes cut from darker black. Somewhere in the valley below, a river nobody had bothered to name spoke in a language older than nations. She stopped at the boot print. Fresh, maybe 6 hours old. Men's size 11, deep tread pattern, tactical sole. The kind of boot you bought when you wanted people to know you were serious about the outdoors, or serious about looking serious. Morgan crouched, took 3 photographs from different angles with a camera that had seen deployments on 3 continents, measured the stride length with a tape measure she kept in her jacket pocket. 42 inches, long stride, confident, not sneaking, not trying to hide. The 8th violation this month. She stood, scanned the tree line with eyes that had been trained to spot wire buried in sand from 1,000 yards out. Nothing moved. The wind carried no sound but its own voice in the distant conversation of crows discussing something dead. Morgan pulled a small notebook from her chest pocket, the kind with waterproof pages that wouldn't quit when things got wet. Day 243. Pattern confirmed. Threat assessment escalating. The walk back to her cabin took 20 minutes through terrain that had killed smarter people than the men who thought her fence line was a suggestion. She moved with economy, no wasted steps, the kind of efficiency that came from years of carrying heavy things through bad places. The cabin sat in a natural depression, built low and dark against the hillside like it had grown there. 960 acres of wilderness spreading out in every direction. Property she'd bought with money the Navy paid her for doing things they wouldn't talk about to people who wouldn't understand. Inside, she made coffee the same way every day. French press, water at exactly 200 degrees, 4 minutes. No sugar, no cream. While it steeped, she pulled herself up to the bar mounted in the doorframe and counted. 1, 2, 3. At 100, her shoulders burned with the good burn, the kind that meant muscle fibers tearing and rebuilding stronger than before. She dropped, rolled her neck, drank the coffee standing at the window, watching light creep down the mountain faces like God was pulling back a blanket. On the mantle, a photograph gathered dust. 3 people, a man in army camouflage, ranger scroll visible on his shoulder, a girl, maybe 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, another man, older, Navy uniform, silver hair even then. The photo was dated 2006, back when the world made a different kind of sense. Morgan set down her coffee and walked to the gun safe. The M40A6 rifle came out smooth, well-oiled, maintained with the kind of care most people reserve for children or classic cars. She checked the chamber out of habit, even though she knew it was empty, ran her hand down the stock, felt the familiar weight settle into muscle memory. This rifle had reached out across distances that turned men into ideas, had spoken a language that needed no translation. Now it sat above her fireplace like a retired athlete, still capable but no longer in the game. She put it back. Not yet. Instead, she grabbed her pack, the black one with straps adjusted to her frame, and loaded it with items that would make a civilian ask questions. Trail camera, range-finding binoculars, notebook, pencil, energy bars that tasted like cardboard mixed with broken dreams but would keep you alive when nothing else would. She added the small handheld radio, turned it to the frequency she'd been monitoring, listened to static. They weren't talking yet. They would. At 700, Morgan headed for the high ground, 8 miles into her property, where the fence line ran along a ridge that separated civilization from wilderness. 5 men were setting up camp with the kind of organization that spoke to experience. They had 3 trucks, heavy-duty, lifted, the kind that cost more than her cabin. They had tents, not the department store kind, but expedition grade, designed for mountains that wanted you dead. They had equipment, a lot of equipment, too much equipment for a weekend hunting trip. Morgan watched from 400 yards out, belly down in the rocks, ghillie suit breaking up her outline into a suggestion of nature. Through her spotting scope, she could see faces, read body language, build profiles. The leader was maybe 50, weathered the way men weather when they've spent time in places with bad water and worse people. He moved with authority, pointed, and people moved. Ex-military, not National Guard weekend warrior. The real thing. He wore his authority like a second skin, and the others deferred without question. Morgan watched him organize the camp perimeter, check sight lines, establish fields of fire. Not amateur hour, not even close. The second man was older, quieter, mid-40s, maybe pushing 50, with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to think before acting. He checked weapons with practiced hands, cleared each rifle, laid them in neat rows. Family man, Morgan guessed. Wedding ring worn smooth. He pulled a satellite phone from his pack, checked for signal, frowned at the screen, put it away. The way he handled gear spoke to training, but the way he hesitated before following the leader's orders spoke to doubt. The third was younger, late 30s, everything about him expensive. Jacket that cost 4 figures, boots that had never seen mud before this trip. Watch that could buy a used car. He talked too much, laughed too loud, handled his rifle like a prop in a movie about himself. Rich kid playing soldier, dangerous because he thought he wasn't. The fourth man was local. Morgan could tell by the way he moved through the terrain, reading it like text. He knew these mountains. Not as well as she did, but enough to be confident. Tracker, hunter. The kind of man who'd grown up pulling triggers at things that couldn't shoot back and thought that made him apex. The fifth was youngest, early 30s, looking at the others for cues on how to act. Follower, every group had one. The man who went along because going along is easier than standing apart, who would do terrible things and blame the crowd, who was harmless alone and dangerous in numbers. Morgan lowered her scope and wrote in her notebook. Alpha, Thornton ex-contractor, pride weakness. Beta, Keegan, family man, satellite phone, doubt vulnerability. Gamma, Nolan, money insulated, fear of loss. Delta, Shaw, local territorial instinct. Omega, Archer, follower, hero complex. She'd been watching them for 243 days. She knew their patterns better than they did. Knew that Thornton woke first, always at 0530, checked perimeter before coffee. Knew that Keegan called home every night at 2000, talked to someone named Connor, voice soft in a way it never was around the others. Knew that Nolan took pills from an orange bottle, anti-anxiety probably, washed them down with expensive whiskey. Knew that Shaw checked his phone compulsively, looking for signal that never came this deep. Knew that Archer wrote in a journal, pages filled with thoughts he'd never speak aloud. Knowledge was preparation. Preparation was survival. This was what they'd taught her at a place called Coronado, where the Pacific Ocean tried to drown you every morning and the instructors tried to break you every afternoon. This was what Brennan had drilled into her skull over and over until it was reflex, not thought. At 1400, while the 5 men were eating lunch around a fire they'd built, too big and too bright, Morgan moved. She descended from her position with the silence of erosion, taking 30 minutes to cover ground she could sprint in 3. Every step placed with care. Every branch noted and avoided. Every rock tested before committed weight. She moved the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, inevitable and patient. She got within 50 yards of their camp. From this distance, she could hear conversation. Thornton was talking about some operation in the sandbox, dates that matched Iraq's surge years. Keegan was listening with the expression of someone who'd heard the stories before, but couldn't say so. Nolan was on his phone, no signal, scrolling through downloaded content. Shaw was studying a map, planning something. Archer was cleaning a rifle he'd already cleaned twice today. Morgan pulled 8 small devices from her pack. Each one was the size of a deck of cards, matte black, waterproof, battery-powered. She'd assembled them in her cabin over the course of a week, using components ordered from electronic suppliers who asked no questions. They were simple: Bluetooth receiver connected to a speaker, connected to a battery pack that would run for 72 hours. No recording, no transmission, just playback. She moved through the perimeter like smoke, placing devices in locations she'd mapped during previous observations. One in a hollow tree 40 yards north, one under a rock overhang 60 yards east, one buried in pine needles 70 yards south, one wedged into a crevice 80 yards west, 4 more scattered at intermediate points, creating a 360-degree coverage. While she worked, Thornton stood from the fire and walked to the tree line. Morgan froze. She was behind a fallen log, 20 feet from his position, no cover if he looked down. He stopped, unbuttoned his pants, Started to urinate against a pine tree, steam rising in the cold air. Morgan didn't breathe, didn't move, became stone, became nothing. This was the training. This was the discipline. Heart rate down, awareness up, every sense cataloging information without processing it. Thornton was muttering something about needing to filter more water. His stream hit bark with a sound like rain on tin. A crow called from somewhere overhead. The fire crackled. Thornton finished, zipped up, turned. He looked directly at Morgan's position. For 3 seconds, that lasted forever, his eyes swept the log line. Morgan could see his pupils contract in the afternoon light, could see the stubble on his jaw, the scar on his left cheek, the way his hand moved unconsciously toward the pistol on his belt. He looked away, walked back to camp. Morgan exhaled slowly, counted to 100, completed her replacement. At 1600, she was gone, exfiltrating the way she'd come, leaving no trace but the devices that would speak for her when the time came. By 1900, she was back at her cabin, gear stowed, coffee brewing. The sun was setting over peaks that had no names, painting the sky in colors that cameras couldn't capture. Morgan stood on her porch, mug in hand, looking out over land that was hers. Not the Navy's, not the government's, not some corporations or some politicians or some causes. Hers. Bought with money earned doing things that left marks on her soul deeper than any scar. 960 acres of silence. 960 acres of peace. 960 acres where she made the rules. And 5 men thought they could cross her fence like it meant nothing. Inside, she opened the drawer where the satellite phone lived. Military grade, encrypted, the kind of hardware that cost more than most people's cars. One contact in the directory, just one, listed as Brennan. Morgan stared at the phone for 10 minutes. Her hand hovered over it 3 times. Each time she pulled back. Each time the weight of what calling meant pressed down like atmosphere at depth. Finally, on the 4th approach, she picked it up, turned it on, waited for the connection to satellites passing overhead in orbits that cared nothing for human drama. The call connected. 8 seconds of silence that felt like 8 hours. The voice that answered carried gravel and distance in something that might have been concern. Been wondering when you'd call. Morgan's throat tightened. Sir, I have a situation. The man on the other end, Colonel Marcus Brennan, had been retired for 6 years. 72 years old. 4 decades in naval special warfare. Instructor at Coronado. Mentor to more SEALs than any other man alive. And for the last 20 years of Morgan's life, the closest thing to a father she'd ever known. Montana situation or global situation, he asked. Oregon, she corrected. Local property issue. Pause, thinking, calculating, talk to me. Morgan pulled up her laptop, opened the surveillance file. 5 males, ages approximately 35 to 55. Repeated trespass violations over the past 8 months. Documented incursions. 243 days. Patterns suggest recreational use without permission. Initial violations were opportunistic. Recent activity shows increasing territorial behavior and property damage. You file with local law. Affirmative. Sheriff's jurisdiction is unclear this far into mountain territory. Nearest station is 6 hours response time under optimal conditions. They logged the complaint. Nothing happened. Another pause, longer. What kind of escalation are we talking about? Morgan pulled up trail camera footage from the previous week. 5 individuals approached within 200 yards of my cabin, spray-painted threats on outbuildings, deliberate destruction of property markers. Duration of incident, 40 minutes. Intent, intimidation. She could hear Brennan's breathing change. Not quite a sigh, something with harder edges. You held position. Affirmative, did not engage, did not reveal presence. Gathered intelligence only. Good girl. The approval was slight but unmistakable. You've got 3 options here. Want to hear them? Yes, sir. Option 1. You sell, take a loss if you need to. Move somewhere with better law enforcement coverage. Sometimes tactical withdrawal is a smart play. He paused. They both knew what her silence meant. Option 2, you accept it. Increased security, better locks, more cameras. Document everything. Hope they get bored or sloppy enough that law enforcement eventually takes action. You absorb the harassment as the cost of living where you want to live. More silence. Mountains in the distance were going dark. Option 3, Brennan's voice changed, dropped lower, took on the edge she remembered from briefings before operations that didn't officially exist. You remind them why I spent 14 years teaching you what I taught you. But if you choose option 3, you need to understand something. There are rules. I'm listening. Rule 1, no killing. You put a body on the ground, that's murder. All your documentation and all my contacts can't protect you from that. Rule 2, no evidence that points back to direct action on your part. If they get hurt, it's because they made bad decisions in dangerous terrain, not because you forced them into anything. Rule 3, but you give them a chance to walk away. Clear warning, opportunity to withdraw. You only proceed if they ignore the final offer. Morgan was quiet, processing. You're talking about psychological operations. I'm talking about making them understand that your property is not a place they want to be, that the fence line is not a suggestion, that you are not a target. Brennan paused. You remember what I told you about the Desert Storm operation in '91? The Iraqi command post. That's the one. 7 officers in a bunker complex. My team had orders to eliminate them. We didn't shoot people. We shot their infrastructure, cut their radio, poisoned their water supply, made them believe they were under sustained attack from a force 10 times our actual size. They scattered into the desert. 40 hours later, the desert finished what we started. We never fired a shot at a human target. Mission accomplished. The Wolf Protocol, Morgan said quietly. That's what the boys called it afterward. Not because we were hunting them, because we made them believe they were being hunted. And when you believe that, really believe it, you make decisions that get you killed even when nobody's pulling a trigger. Brennan's voice softened. But Morgan, you need to understand what you're choosing if you go this route. It's not combat. It's not self-defense in the legal sense. It's something else, and you have to live with that afterward. I've lived with worse. I know you have. That's why I'm asking if you're sure. Morgan looked at the photograph on the mantle. 8 years old, gap-toothed, flanked by her father and Brennan, back when they were both still young enough to believe in things like justice and honor and lines that meant something. Her father had died in Fallujah when she was 12. Brennan had shown up at the funeral in dress blues, stood next to her while they folded the flag, and quietly asked if she wanted to come live with him. She'd said yes. He'd taught her to shoot when she was 14, taught her to think when she was 16, pushed her toward the Navy when she was 18, stood in the back of the room when she graduated BUD/S at 23, one of the first women to make it through, and nodded once. Just once. That had been enough. If I do this, she said slowly, I need guidance. Real time if possible. You willing to walk me through it? I'm 72 years old and I live in a retirement community where the biggest excitement is when someone's son visits from out of state. You think I'm going to say no to one more operation? Despite everything, she almost smiled. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. We've got work to do. First thing, you need to know everything about these 5 men, not just their names and their vehicles. I mean everything. Family, skills, weaknesses, psychology. You can't manipulate behavior if you don't understand motivation. I have most of that already. Of course you do. Brennan's approval carried warmth. Send me what you've got. I'll review tonight and we'll talk tomorrow at 0600 your time. And Morgan, get some sleep. Once this starts, you won't get much for a while. The call ended. Morgan sat in the darkness of her cabin, listening to wind outside and the subtle sounds of mountains settling into night. Somewhere out there, 8 miles deep on her property, 5 men were probably sitting around their too bright fire, drinking beer, congratulating themselves on how they'd claimed territory from a woman who thought ownership meant something. They had no idea what was coming. She walked to the closet where gear from another life was stored in vacuum-sealed bags. The tactical vest with the faded trident patch that marked her as Navy, as SEAL, as part of something most people only saw in movies that got the details wrong. Her hand hovered over it. She could pull it out, put it on, become that person again. Not yet. Instead, she opened the black notebook and wrote in careful script, Day 243, final warning posted. Protocol selection, Wolf, Brennan advised. Proceed 0400. Then she set her watch alarm for 4 in the morning and sat in the dark, waiting. The hunting camp was professional in setup. 5 men who knew what they were doing had established position 8 miles inside Morgan's boundary line, far from any road, deep in terrain that required 4-wheel drive and confidence to access. They had portable stations for processing game, high-end rifles with optics that cost more than some people's monthly rent, solar panels charging battery banks for their electronics. This was not a weekend lark. This was organized, repeated, deliberate. Thornton was cleaning his rifle when Keegan approached from the tree line. You hear that earlier? Keegan asked. Hear what? Sounded like something moving through the brush. North side, maybe 1400. Thornton didn't look up from his cleaning. Probably elk. They're all over this area. Maybe. Keegan sat down on a camp chair that creaked under his weight. You ever think we should just find somewhere else? Somewhere without the constant back and forth with whoever owns this land. Thornton looked up now. We've been running these mountains for 6 years, long before that woman bought the deed and decided to pretend she owns what can't be owned. This is public land as far as I'm concerned. Forest Service just hasn't caught up with the paperwork. Keegan was quiet. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, the river nobody had named continued its eternal conversation with Stone. "You going soft on me?" Thornton asked. Not quite accusation, not quite question, just thinking about Connor. My boy, he's over in Pendleton now. Marines, tells me stories about rules of engagement, about knowing when to push and when to pull back. Makes me think maybe we're pushing when we should be pulling. Thornton went back to cleaning his rifle. Each motion practiced, each movement efficient. Your boy is fighting actual enemies in actual war zones. We're camping on land that's been open range since before this country had a name. Not the same thing. Shaw wandered over, beer in hand, grin on his face. "You two having a feeling session. Want me to get my guitar and we can sing Kumbaya?" Keegan stood, walked away without responding. Shaw watched him go, took a long pull from his beer, tossed the can into the bushes where it landed with a sound that carried farther than he thought. Thornton looked at the can, looked at Shaw, said nothing. This was the dynamic. This was the pattern Morgan had watched for 243 days. Thornton led through competence and conviction. Keegan followed through loyalty but questioned privately. Nolan bought his way into belonging. Shaw belonged because he always had, because these mountains were his inheritance in ways that had nothing to do with deeds or dollars. Archer belonged because the others let him. At 2200, they settled into sleeping bags, comfortable and secure in the knowledge that they owned this moment, this place, this night. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled overhead, the mountains kept their secrets. None of them knew that 400 yards above their position, a woman in a ghillie suit was watching through optics that could count their heartbeats, building a plan that would make them wish they'd listened to warnings that came in official letterhead and fence line signs. At 400, Morgan moved. She'd descended from her observation post during the early hours when human circadian rhythms hit their lowest point, when watchstanders fight sleep and lose. The camp below was quiet. One man on watch, Archer, sitting by the fire's remains, trying to stay awake with coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Morgan activated the first device at 0430. The sound was simple, a branch breaking, the kind of noise that happens 10,000 times a day in any forest. Natural, explainable. Except this break happened during the 3-second window when the forest had gone completely silent, when even the wind had paused, when every ear in camp could hear it clearly. Archer's head snapped toward the sound. He stood, grabbed his rifle, peered into darkness that gave nothing back. Morgan watched through her night vision monocular, seeing him in shades of green, reading his body language. Tension, uncertainty. The first seed planted. After 2 minutes, Archer sat back down. Probably nothing. Probably just the forest doing forest things. At 0500, Morgan activated the second device. This one was different. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Walking through underbrush with the deliberate pace of someone who knew where they were going and didn't care who heard. The sound came from the east, ran for 8 seconds, stopped. Archer was on his feet immediately. Hey, everybody up!" Thornton was out of his tent in seconds, pistol in hand, eyes scanning. "What is it?" "Footsteps. Out there. Somebody's walking around the camp." The other 3 emerged, various states of awake, all armed. They stood in a cluster, backs to the fire, facing outward, listening. Silence. "You sure?" Thornton asked. "I heard it. Clear as day. Footsteps. From the trees." "Probably an animal," Nolan said, but his voice carried doubt. "Animals don't walk on 2 legs with that kind of rhythm," Shaw said quietly. He was the tracker. He knew. Thornton made a decision. Full perimeter check. Partners. Shaw and Nolan, you take north and east. Keegan and Archer, south and west. I'll hold center. Radio if you see anything at all. They spread out, flashlights cutting the darkness into pieces, boots crunching on ground that had been frozen and thawed 1,000 times. Morgan watched from her hide, tracking each pair, noting their patterns, their spacing, their competence. Shaw moved well. Keegan moved carefully. The others moved like men who'd seen training videos but never tested the training. At 0520, they returned to camp having found nothing. "Could have sworn," Archer muttered. Thornton looked at him, looked at the tree line, looked at the sky beginning to lighten in the east. "Everyone stays sharp today. Double watch tonight. Something's off." Morgan smiled in the darkness. The wolf protocol had begun. First phase, make them aware, make them listen, make them doubt their own senses. The human mind is an engine that runs on pattern recognition. Disrupt the patterns, and the mind starts writing stories to explain the disruption. Usually those stories are wrong. Always, those stories create fear. At 0600, Morgan's phone vibrated. She moved back from her position, Found cover in a cluster of boulders, answered. Status, Brennan said. Phase 1 initiated. Subjects are aware of anomalous sounds, stress indicators visible. No panic yet. Maintaining observation position. Good. When do you move to Phase 2? Morgan looked at the sky. Clear. No precipitation forecast. Tonight, 2300 hours. Equipment tampering. High risk, Brennan said. You'll be operating within close proximity to their position while they're on heightened alert. If anyone wakes, if they post a guard you don't account for, you're compromised. I understand the risk. Pause. Once you cross that line, once you start directly manipulating their equipment, this becomes something different. Are you sure? She looked down at the camp, at 5 men who had ignored every legal warning, every posted sign, every attempt at civilized resolution. Who had come to her home in the darkness and spray-painted threats? Who had made her feel unsafe in the only place she'd ever felt safe? I'm sure. All right then. Brennan's voice carried the tone she remembered from mission briefings. I'll be standing by. You run into trouble, you call immediately. Understood. And Morgan, remember the 3 phases. Phase 1, awareness. Phase 2, vulnerability. Phase 3, decision point. Each phase has to be complete before moving to the next. You rush this, you lose control of the narrative. Exactly. She ended the call. The sun was fully up now, light pouring down the mountain faces like water finding level. In the camp below, 5 men were making breakfast, drinking coffee, trying to convince themselves that the sounds in the night were nothing, that the feeling of being watched was paranoia, that they were still in control. They were wrong on every count. Morgan settled into her hide for a long day of observation. This was familiar territory. This was what she'd been trained for. The waiting, the watching, the patience that separated professionals from amateurs. In Fallujah, she'd waited 43 hours in a hide for a target that might not show. In the Hindu Kush, she'd spent 6 days in position observing a compound, eating cold rations, using bags for necessities, never moving more than inches. This was nothing. This was comfortable. At 1800, the sun began its descent. Shadows stretched long across the valley. Temperature dropped. The 5 men prepared dinner. A gradually wound down. By 2200, 4 were intense. Thornton was on watch, sitting by a carefully controlled fire, rifle across his knees. Morgan waited until 2300, then she moved. The approach took 40 minutes. Every step calculated, every sound anticipated and avoided. The distance was only 300 yards, but speed was suicide. Patience was survival. She covered the ground like water flowing downhill, inevitable and silent. At 50 yards out, she could see Thornton clearly. He was alert but not alarmed, scanning the perimeter but seeing nothing. Morgan was a shadow among shadows, a suggestion of movement that the eye dismissed as wind in the branches. 30 yards, 20, 10. The equipment area was her target. 5 rifles leaned against a makeshift rack. Ammunition boxes stacked nearby. She needed to get to them, complete her work, and be gone before Thornton's watch rotation ended at 0100. She waited for wind. It came at 2340, pushing through the pines with enough noise to cover the sound of her final approach. She moved during the gust, froze when it passed, moved again with the next one. At 2350, she was at the equipment rack. 5 rifles. She worked in the dark, no light, everything by touch and memory. Removed the firing pin from each weapon with tools she'd machined herself in her cabin workshop. The first one took 40 seconds. The second took 30. By the 5th, she had it down to 20. The pins went into a small bag she tucked into her chest pocket. Next, the ammunition. 7 boxes. She opened each one, removed every round, arranged them in a perfect circle on a flat stone near the fire pit. 247 rounds total. The center of the circle she left empty, except for a single note card, placed with the kind of precision that spoke to someone who cared about messages. Firing pins removed. Leave now. She stepped back to admire her work. In the darkness, it looked almost artistic. Then she heard the zipper. Someone was getting out of their tent. Morgan froze. Every muscle locked. Heart rate spiked, then forced down through sheer will. Breathing stopped. This was the moment. This was where training either worked or failed catastrophically. Keegan stumbled out of his tent, clearly half asleep, heading for the portable latrine they'd set up downwind. He was 10 feet away, moving directly toward her position. Morgan had 3 seconds to make a choice. She dropped to the ground like gravity had doubled, pressed herself flat against the earth, face in the dirt, became part of the landscape. Stillness so complete it wasn't human, it was mineral. It was death pretending to be alive, pretending to be nothing. Keegan walked past her position, 4 feet away, close enough that she could hear his breathing, could smell coffee on his breath from dinner. could count the loops on his bootlaces. He never looked down, never saw her. Just walked to the latrine, used it, walked back to his tent. The zipper closed. Morgan counted to 300. 5 full minutes of lying motionless on cold ground while her heart hammered and training screamed at her to move, to withdraw, to get clear before luck ran out. At 300, she rose like smoke and reversed her approach path. At 0130, she was clear. At 0200, she was back at her observation post. Her phone buzzed at 2:20. She answered. "Talk to me," Brennan said. Phase 2 complete, no compromise. All firing pins removed and displayed. Warning note placed. Currently in observation position. Any issues? One subject exited tent during placement. Passed within contact range. Did not detect my presence. She heard Brennan exhale. That's too close. Mission accomplished regardless. Mission accomplished isn't the same as mission accomplished safely. He paused. What's your plan for phase 3? Let them discover what I've done. Observe reaction. Based on their response, I'll determine timing and approach for final phase. Get some rest. You've got a few hours before sunrise. Morgan leaned back against cold stone, pulled a thermal blanket from her pack, wrapped it around her shoulders. The stars were sharp overhead. The temperature was dropping toward freezing. Somewhere in the valley, the unnamed river continued its eternal work of turning mountains into sand. At 0530, Thornton emerged from his tent to restart the fire. Morgan watched through her binoculars as he saw the ammunition immediately. Watched his body language change. Watched him freeze mid-step. Watched his hand drop to his hip where a sidearm hung. Watched him look around the camp in a quick 360, searching for threats. Then he saw the note. He picked it up, read it, read it again. His face went through a sequence of expressions that would have been comical in any other context. Confusion, disbelief, anger, fear. He walked to the rifle rack, grabbed his weapon, dropped the magazine, saw that it was full, worked the action. No firing pin. The bolt cycled empty. He checked the other rifles, all the same. Everyone up, get up now. The shout tore through the morning quiet. Within seconds, all the 5 men were out of their tents, armed, confused. Thornton held up the note in the circle of ammunition. Someone was here last night, in our camp, while we were sleeping. They took every firing pin out of every rifle and left this. Silence. Shock. The kind of silence that follows revelations that break fundamental assumptions about safety. Nolan's face had gone pale. What do you mean someone was here? We had 5 guys sleeping 10 feet apart. Nobody could get that close without waking someone. Well, somebody did. Thornton's voice carried edges. Look at this. 247 rounds arranged in a perfect circle. This wasn't random. This wasn't an animal. This was deliberate. Keegan picked up one of the rounds, turned it over in his fingers like it might explain itself. I got up at midnight, used the latrine. I walked right past this spot. There was nothing here. Shaw was looking around with wide eyes. You think it was that woman, the one who owns this land? Of course it was her, Nolan said, his voice climbing half an octave. Who else would it be? She's been watching us this whole time. Thornton was trying to reassert control. Okay, everyone calm down. So she found our camp. So she played some kind of prank. We're 5 men. She's 1 woman. She had to sneak around in the dark because she's too afraid to confront us directly. But Keegan was shaking his head. You don't understand. Look at how the rounds are arranged. Look at the note. This wasn't a prank. This was a message. She's telling us she could have done anything while we slept. She could have hurt us. She chose not to. This is a warning. A warning, Thornton said. He grabbed the note, crumpled it. I don't get warned off my hunting grounds by some woman playing tactical games. Maybe we should, Keegan said quietly. Maybe we should take the warning and go home. No way, Nolan said, some bravado returning. We're not going to let her chase us off. Shaw was studying the ammunition circle. This took time. This took patience. Whoever did this was in our camp for at least 15, 20 minutes. While we slept, while Thornton was on watch. He looked at Thornton, no offense. Thornton said nothing. His jaw was tight. The group stood in silence, each man processing what had happened, what it meant, what it said about their assumptions and their safety and their control. Morgan watched through her binoculars, reading faces, gauging reactions. The group was fracturing. Keegan wanted to leave. Nolan wanted to fight. Thornton was caught between pride and growing recognition that they'd underestimated their opponent. Shaw was reassessing the terrain he thought he owned. Archer was looking to others for cues. After 20 minutes of argument, Thornton made his decision. We're staying, but we're doing it smart. From now on, 2 men awake at all times. Watch rotation every 2 hours. We check perimeter every hour. And tomorrow morning we pack up and move to a new location deeper in the forest. It was exactly the wrong decision. Exactly what Morgan had hoped he would decide. Moving deeper meant moving farther from help. meant isolating themselves even more, meant giving her more terrain to work with, more options, more control. Keegan tried one more time. Thornton, this is a bad idea. We should leave. Thornton looked at him. I'm not running from some woman who thinks she owns mountains. Keegan looked at the other men searching for support. Found none. They were scared, but they were more scared of looking weak. Morgan lowered her binoculars. She'd seen enough. The wolf protocol was working. They were aware. They were vulnerable. Now they just needed to make the final choice. Stay and face consequences or leave while they still could. She pulled out her sat phone, dialed, waited. Brennan answered. Status. They're not leaving. Leader is choosing pride over prudence. Group is fracturing, but holding. Recommend proceeding to Phase 3 ahead of schedule. Pause. Concur. Subjects in heightened stress state. Optimal conditions for psychological escalation. Proceed with caution. Morgan ended the call, looked down at the camp where 5 men were trying to convince themselves they were still in control, trying to believe that doubled watches and perimeter checks would protect them from someone who'd been invisible when she was 4 feet away. The sun climbed higher. The day warmed. In the camp below, 5 men tried to relax, tried to act normal, tried to pretend that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It would never be fine again. Because 400 yards above them, a woman who'd survived things that would break most men was planning Phase 3. And Phase 3 was where polite warnings ended and real consequences began. She'd given them 243 days. She'd given them legal notices. She'd given them fence line signs. She'd given them a warning carved in ammunition and missing firing pins. Now she was going to give them fear. The kind of fear that followed you home, that woke you at 3 a.m., that made you question every shadow and every sound. The kind of fear that stayed with you long after you had left the mountains behind. Morgan packed her gear, checked her equipment, ran through scenarios. At 1800, she would begin final preparations. At 2300, she would execute Phase 3. After that, the 5 men would have one last chance to choose wisely. Morgan had survived 12 years in the teams by trusting her training and trusting her mentor. Brennan's voice was in her head, would always be in her head, the lessons carved into neural pathways deeper than conscious thought. She looked at the sat phone, thought about calling again, decided against it. She knew what he would say, knew the rules, knew the mission, knew herself. That was enough. The mountains held at her silence. The river spoke to stone. The wind carried no judgment. And somewhere on 960 acres of land that belonged to a woman who'd earned it in currency that couldn't be counted, 5 men who thought ownership was a game were about to learn that some boundaries were written in more than ink and fence posts. They were written in consequence, and consequence was coming. The decision to move deeper into the forest was made at 0900 on day 3, after 2 hours of argument that circled the same territory like wolves around a campfire. Thornton stood with his back to the cold remains of their fire, arms crossed, jaw set in the way of men who'd decided that backing down was worse than being wrong. Keegan sat on a camp chair that had seen better days, turning an empty rifle over in his hands, like it might suddenly explain how someone had violated their perimeter while 5 armed men slept 20 feet away. Nolan paced, expensive boots leaving tracks in ground that had frozen overnight and would freeze again tonight. Shaw studied his maps with the focus of someone who believed paper could protect him from what was happening. Archer just stood there, young and uncertain, waiting for someone older to tell him what fear meant and whether he was allowed to feel it. We moved to the secondary location, Thornton said. 3 miles northeast, higher elevation, better sight lines, defensive position. Keegan looked up from the rifle. Or we could just leave, drive out, go home, tell our families we had a good trip and it's over. And let her win, Nolan said. Let some woman with a god complex chase us off land we've been using for years. It's not our land, Keegan said quietly. It never was. Thornton's voice carried the edge of command, the tone that had moved men through bad places when reason said stop. We're not running, we're repositioning. We're taking this seriously. That's smart tactics. That's adaptation. But we're not running. The vote, such as it was, went 3-1 with Archer abstaining because abstaining was what Archer did. They spent the next 2 hours breaking camp with none of the easy confidence they'd shown setting it up. Every sound in the forest made someone stop and look. Every branch crack was potential threat. Every bird call was possible signal. The paranoia that Morgan had planted was growing roots, spreading through the group like water finding cracks in concrete. By 1200, they were mobile. 3 trucks loaded with gear that suddenly seemed inadequate. 5 men who suddenly seemed small. They drove northeast, following logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance since before some of them were born, deeper into terrain that made their phones useless and their confidence smaller. Morgan watched from a ridge 2 miles distant, tracking their movement through binoculars that had seen deployments on 4 continents. She'd predicted this. had known that Thornton's pride would push them further in rather than pull them out, had already scouted the secondary location they were heading toward, had already prepared it, had already turned it from refuge into trap. She pulled out her sat phone, dialed the only number in the directory, waited for connection. The voice that answered carried warmth and distance and something that might have been static. They're moving to secondary position right on schedule. Good, Brennan said. Predictable patterns make for successful operations. You ready for phase 3? Morgan looked at the sky. Clear, temperature dropping. They'll reach the new site by 1400. I'll give them time to settle. Hit them at 1900 when confidence returns. Cascade pattern or precision strikes? Cascade. I want them hearing threats from every direction. Want them to feel surrounded even though it's just me. There was a pause on the line, longer than usual. Morgan, you remember what I taught you about projection? Sir, when you make someone believe they're facing a larger force, you can't slip. One mistake, one piece of evidence that shows it's a single operator, and the whole illusion collapses. They go from panic to angry. Angry men with guns are more dangerous than scared men with guns. I understand. Do you? Because I'm sitting here in Virginia, and you're sitting there in Oregon, and if something goes wrong, I can't pull you out. Morgan was quiet, listening to static on the line that seemed louder than it should be. I've got this, sir. Trust the training. I do trust the training. I'm the one who gave it to you. That's why I know how easy it is to overcommit, to push one step too far. The call ended. Morgan sat in silence, staring at the phone. Something about the conversation felt off. Not wrong exactly, just displaced. Like listening to a recording of a voice you knew but couldn't quite place in time. She shook it off, focused on the mission. The men below were her concern now. Everything else was noise. By 1400, Thornton's group had established their new camp in a natural bowl surrounded by granite walls on 3 sides, open to the south. Defensible if you were worried about ground assault. A fatal funnel if you understood how sound worked in mountain acoustics. Morgan had stood in this exact spot 2 months ago, testing echoes, mapping reverb patterns, understanding how noise would bounce and multiply and create the illusion of numbers where there was only one. She placed audio devices here weeks ago, 12 of them, hidden in rock crevices and tree hollows and buried under pine needles. Waterproofed, battery-powered, waiting. The men set up tents with the speed of people who wanted walls between themselves and the forest. They established watch rotation immediately. 2 men awake at all times. Perimeter checks every 30 minutes. Rifles kept loaded even without firing pins because the weight of a weapon was psychological armor, even when the weapon was dead. Shaw was on watch with Archer when the first sound came. It was 1900, right on schedule. The sun had dropped behind the western peaks, painting the world in shades of blue that made distance hard to judge. Temperature was falling fast. Breath misted. Hands sought pockets. The sound was simple. A cough, human, male, coming from the north, maybe 50 yards out. Shaw's head snapped toward it. Did you hear that? Archer nodded, hand tightening on his rifle. Somebody's out there. They waited, listened. The forest gave them nothing but wind. Then came the second sound. A different cough, different location, east, closer, maybe 30 yards. Shaw stood fast, grabbed his radio. Thornton, we got activity, multiple contacts. Inside the tent, Thornton was pulling on boots before Shaw finished the sentence. The other 3 were scrambling, grabbing weapons, emerging into the cold evening with eyes that hadn't adjusted and hearts that were already running. What have we got? Thornton said. Coughing, Shaw said. 2 different locations, 2 different people, or 1 person moving, Nolan offered. Then came the third cough. South, the open side of their bowl, the side they'd left undefended because that's where they could see. That's 3, Archer said, his voice climbing. There's 3 of them. Or 1 person with speakers, Keegan said quietly. Remember the footsteps. Remember how this worked before. Thornton was scanning the tree line with eyes that had seen combat, but never combat like this. Never the kind where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Never the kind where sound was weapon and darkness was ammunition. Spread out, he ordered. 20-yard intervals. Flash your lights on my signal. We flush them out all at once. They spread. 5 men with flashlights and empty rifles forming a perimeter, waiting for Thornton's word. Morgan watched from 300 yards out, night vision turning the world green, seeing them cluster and separate and cluster again, like cells trying to divide. Thornton raised his hand. Now. 5 flashlight beams stabbed into darkness. 5 circles of light swept trees and rocks and shadows. They found nothing, no movement, no people, no threat. No. Then Morgan activated all 12 devices simultaneously. The effect was overwhelming. Coughing from every direction at once. North, south, east, west. Above on the granite walls. Below in the gullies. The sound bounced and multiplied and created the acoustic illusion of 30 people surrounding their position, closing in, coughing with the rhythm of the approaching crowd. The 5 men spun, lights cutting chaos into the dark, each beam finding empty forest, each emptiness confirming that whatever was out there wasn't where they were looking. Contact, someone yelled. Southwest. Negative, someone else yelled. That's Echo. Northeast is Origin. They're everywhere, Archer said, and his voice had broken into registers that men his age shouldn't reach. The coughing stopped as suddenly as it started. Silence rushed in like water filling a hole. The 5 men stood in their formation, breathing hard, pointing lights at nothing, listening to their own hearts hammer. Thornton's radio crackled. Static. Then a voice. Female. Calm. So calm it was worse than shouting. You're surrounded. Leave while you can. The transmission ended. The radio went dead. Every man stared at the radio in Thornton's hand like it had betrayed them. That was her, Nolan said. That was the woman. On our frequency, Shaw said. She's been listening to us this whole time. Thornton looked at the radio, looked at his men, looked at the darkness that pressed in from every side. For the first time since Morgan had started watching him 243 days ago, she saw doubt crack his certainty. Everyone back to camp, he said. Now, stay tight. They moved as a unit, backs together, lights sweeping, expecting attack from every shadow. None came. Morgan let them retreat. Let them huddle around a fire they built too big and too bright. Let them feel small. At 2000, Keegan took his satellite phone away from the group and keyed it to scan for signal. He'd carried this phone as backup for years. Military surplus he'd bought at auction, kept charged out of habit. He walked to the perimeter, raised it toward the sky, watched the screens search for satellites. No signal. Not this deep, not in this terrain. He pulled out his handheld radio instead, switched to a private frequency, the one he used to call home. Connor, he said into the static, if you can hear this, if somehow this gets through, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you, should have left when I had the chance. He released the key, waited. Nothing came back. The mountains didn't care about apologies. Morgan was already moving to the next position. The photo placement would happen at 0400 during the dead hours when circadian rhythm hit bottom and watchstanders fought battles with their own biology. She had 5 photos in her pack, 5 moments of privacy violated, 5 pieces of evidence that someone had been close enough to see what they thought was hidden. But first, she had to call Brennan. She found a position a quarter mile from their camp, settled into cover, pulled out the sat phone, dialed, waited for connection that should have been incident but took 8 seconds, 9, 10. When the voice answered, it sounded distant, like someone calling from the bottom of a well. Status, Brennan said. Phase 3 initiated. Subjects are experiencing surround sound psychological assault. Stress levels critical. 1 attempted radio contact with family. Group cohesion fracturing. Good work. What's your next move? Photo placement at 400. Individual targeting. Make it personal. There was a pause. Morgan could hear something in the background of the call. Wind, maybe, or interference, or something else. Morgan, Brennan said, and his voice carried weight. You need to be careful here. You're moving from general intimidation to specific targeting. That's the line where psychology becomes personal, where fear becomes rage. I understand the risk, do you? Because once you show them you've been watching their private moments, documenting their vulnerabilities, they're going to feel violated. Violated people do unpredictable things. They've been violating my land for 8 months, Morgan said. They painted threats on my cabin. They made me feel unsafe in my own home. This is proportional response. The pause on the line stretched longer. When Brennan spoke again, his voice seemed to come from further away. Just remember the rules. No killing, no evidence. Give them the chance to leave. I remember, sir. I remember everything you taught me. The call ended. Morgan stared at the phone, at the screen that showed 5 bars of signal strength, at the call log that showed 47 seconds of connection time. Everything was normal. Everything was fine, except it wasn't. She shook her head, focused. The mission was what mattered. The men in the camp below were what mattered. Everything else was distraction. At 400, she moved. The new camp had better sight lines but worse acoustics for defense. Sound carried, movement echoed. Morgan used this. Approach from the south, the open side, because they'd be watching the enclosed sides where they felt vulnerable. She moved during wind gusts, froze during calm, timed her advance to natural rhythms. 2 men were on watch, Thornton and Shaw. Both looked exhausted, fighting sleep, fighting fear, fighting the knowledge that something was out there in the dark and they couldn't stop it. Morgan got to within 40 yards. 30, 20. The tree she'd selected was perfect. Large pine, thick trunk, positioned where morning light would hit it at exactly the right angle. She pulled the photos from her pack. 5 photographs, each one captured with a telephoto lens from distances that should have been impossible. Each one showing a moment of privacy that proved someone had been watching when they thought they were alone. Photo 1. Thornton counting cash from his wallet. $3,000 in hundreds. Money he hadn't mentioned to the others. Money from something he'd rather keep quiet. Photo 2. Keegan looking at the photograph he kept in his breast pocket. His son Connor in dress blues, Marine insignia visible. Pride and fear mixed on Keegan's face in the moment he thought no one was watching. Photo 3. Nolan swallowing pills from an orange bottle, the kind of prescription that came with warnings about operation of heavy equipment and judgment impairment. His secret shame. His chemical peace. Photo 4. Shaw on his phone, scrolling through messages from someone named Jennifer. His face showing an expression that suggested Jennifer wasn't his wife. Photo 5. Archer writing in his journal, the page visible enough to read the words, "I don't think I belong here. I don't think I ever did." Morgan taped each photo to the tree trunk at eye level, arranged them in a row, numbered them 1 through 5 in red marker. Above them, she placed a note card. Printed letters. Block capitals. No personality, no rage, just fact. 4 targets, 0 casualties, your choice. She stepped back, examined her work. In the darkness, it looked like an art installation. A gallery of violations, a message written in privacy destroyed. Then she heard footsteps approaching, real ones, not recorded. Actual boots on actual ground, coming from beyond the camp perimeter. Morgan dropped into cover behind a boulder, mind racing. The footsteps came closer, deliberate, unhurried. Someone who knew the terrain. Keegan emerged from the tree line. He was alone, walking outside the camp perimeter in the pre-dawn darkness. In his hand, the satellite phone he'd tried earlier. Still seeking signal, still hoping for connection to the world beyond these mountains. He walked to a spot 30 yards from camp and stopped. He was maybe 15 feet from Morgan's position. Close enough that she could hear him breathing. Close enough to see his face in the faint starlight. He raised the sat phone, looked at the screen, frowned, lowered it, raised it again, turned in a slow circle, seeking signal that wouldn't come. Then he stopped, bent down, picked something up from the ground. Morgan's stomach dropped. It was a metal box, small, weathered, half buried in soil and pine needles. The one she'd buried 8 months ago when she first bought the property. The one containing her old dog tags, her Bud/S graduation photo, the things from a life she'd tried to leave behind. Keegan opened the box. Even from 15 feet away, Morgan could see his face change as he saw what was inside. The dog tags catching starlight. The photo showing a younger version of someone he'd never met. The evidence of who she really was. He stood there for long moments, turning the tags over in his hand, reading the name, reading the service branch, reading the blood type and the religion marked none. Then he pulled out the photo, studied it. Recognition dawned slowly, then all at once. His lips moved. Morgan couldn't hear the words, but she could read them in the way his mouth shaped sounds. Navy SEAL. He looked around, sudden fear in his movements, like the revelation had made him realize how exposed he was, how vulnerable. He put the tags and photo back in the box, closed it, tucked it under his arm, started walking back to camp fast, nearly running. Morgan let him go. She'd been burned. Her identity was compromised. Everything about the operation had just changed. She pulled out her sat phone with shaking hands. Dialed. The connection took longer this time. 15 seconds. 20. When it finally clicked through, the voice sounded wrong. Distant and hollow and broken by static that shouldn't exist on encrypted military satellite communications. "Sir," she said, "we have a problem. Talk to me. One of them found my identification. Old dog tags I'd buried on property. He knows I'm Navy, knows I'm SEAL qualified." Silence. Long silence. Too long. "Sir," she said again, "did you copy?" "I copied," Brennan said, and his voice seemed to come from very far away. "How does this change your operational security?" He'll tell the others. They'll know what they're facing. The psychological advantage decreases when they can put a name and face to the threat. "Not necessarily," Brennan said. "Fear of the known can be just as powerful as fear of the unknown, maybe more. Now they're not fighting some ghost. They're fighting a trained operator. That's confirmation of their worst suspicions. That's validation of their paranoia." Morgan was quiet, thinking it through. "You really think that?" "I think you've already committed to this course of action. I think backing out now would waste everything you have invested. I think you see this through to the end, or you walk away and let them win." The connection crackled. For just a moment, Morgan heard something underneath Brennan's voice. An echo. A doubling. Like 2 versions of the same person speaking slightly out of sync. "Sir," she said, "are you okay? You sound different." "I'm fine, just tired. It's late here." "It's 4:30 on the West Coast. That makes it 7:30 in Virginia. Not late, early. Silence. Then Brennan's voice came back clearer. You're right, I meant early. Long night, not enough sleep, you understand? Yes, sir. Good. Complete the photo placement. Let them find it at dawn. Observe their reaction. We'll reassess after that. The call ended. Morgan stared at the phone. Something was wrong. Something about the conversation felt off in ways she couldn't name. But the mission was still the mission. The men were still on her land. The violations were still real. She moved back to the tree where she'd placed the photos, added one more element. A sixth photo, not of any of them. A photo of herself. Bud/S graduation day. Trident pinned to her chest. Eyes that hadn't yet seen the things they would see. Young and proud and certain. She taped it above the others. Wrote beneath it in the same block capitals. Morgan Hale, USN Class 347. Now they would know. Now the mystery was gone. Now fear would have a face and a name and a service record. She exfiltrated before dawn, got to her observation post by 0530, settled in to watch. The sun rose slowly, light creeping down the granite walls of the bowl they'd chosen for safety. At 600, Thornton emerged from his tent. He saw the photo display immediately. His body went rigid. He walked toward it like approaching something that might explode. Stopped 5 feet away, stared. Then he called out, "Everyone, now!" The other four emerged, saw what Thornton was looking at, approached in a cluster, staying close like proximity was protection. Keegan was the first to speak. "I know who that is. I found her tags last night. I was going to tell you at sunrise." Thornton didn't take his eyes off the photos. "Tell us now." "Her name is Morgan Hale, Navy, Bud/S Class 347. He paused. "That's SEAL training. First female class to graduate, 2019. The silence that followed had weight, had substance. The kind of silence that exists in the moment before explosions or immediately after. Nolan's voice was small. "We're being hunted by a Navy SEAL." Shaw was studying his photo, the one showing him texting Jennifer. She was close enough to read my phone screen, close enough to see who I was messaging. Archer looked at his photo last, the journal entry about not belonging. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been crying. She knows. She knows everything. Thornton ripped down the note card, crumpled it. His hands were shaking. 4 targets, 0 casualties. Your choice. He looked at his men. "She's giving us an out. She's saying leave and nothing happens." "Then we leave," Keegan said, "right now. We pack. We go. This is over." The other 3 nodded, even Nolan, even Shaw. The fight had gone out of them. Morgan had done what she set out to do, had broken them, had made them choose to leave rather than be forced out. Thornton stood there for long moments. War happening behind his eyes. Pride versus survival, ego versus wisdom. The struggle was visible in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands kept clenching and releasing. Finally, he spoke. "We go. Load the trucks. We're out of here by 800. It should have been victory. Should have been the end. Morgan had won. They were leaving. The boundary was enforced. Justice was served. But something made her stay. Made her keep watching. Made her track them as they broke camp with speed born of fear, loaded gear with none of their earlier organization, prepared vehicles for the drive out. At 7:30, they were ready. 5 men in 3 trucks. Escape within reach. They drove south toward the property line, toward civilization, toward safety. Morgan watched from her ridge position, following their progress through binoculars. They should have felt relief, should have felt the tension drain, should have started breathing again. Instead, Nolan's voice came over the radio frequency Morgan had been monitoring. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched? Right now. Like she's out there following us." "We're in vehicles doing 40 miles an hour," Shaw said. "Nobody can follow us on foot." "Unless she's not on foot," Archer said. "What if she has a vehicle we don't know about?" The paranoia was still there, still working, still making them doubt their own perceptions. Morgan had done her job too well. They weren't just leaving, they were fleeing. And fleeing people make mistakes. At 800, they'd covered 3 miles, 6 miles from the property line, 12 miles from pavement and safety. The terrain was getting rougher. The road was getting worse. The trucks were bouncing and sliding and fighting for traction. That's when Archer's voice came over the radio, higher pitched, panicked. "I can't do this. I can't drive another hour staring at trees waiting for something to happen. I'm getting out here." "Don't be stupid," Thornton said. "We stay together. I'm done. I'm done with this. I'm done with you. I'm done with all of it." Archer's truck stopped. The door opened. He stepped out with just a backpack, no weapons, no real supplies. Started walking perpendicular to the road, heading east, crashing through underbrush with all the subtlety of panic. "Archer!" Thornton yelled. Get back here, Archer. But Archer was gone, running now, putting distance between himself and the group, convinced that solo was safer than together, that his odds improved alone. Thornton made a decision. Let him go. We can't help someone who won't help himself. The three trucks continued south. 4 men now instead of 5. The group smaller, the loss hanging over them like smoke. Morgan had a choice to make. Follow the foreign vehicles, or track the one on foot. Logic said follow the vehicles. Mission completion said make sure they left the property. But something deeper, something ethical, made her turn toward Archer. He was running blind, no map, no compass, no understanding of terrain, heading east when he should go south, moving toward higher elevation when he should seek lower, making every mistake that people made when panic overrode training. Morgan tracked him from a distance, watching him exhaust himself, watching him slow from run to jog to walk to stumble. By 1,000, he was 2 miles from the road, deep in terrain that would kill him if he couldn't find his way out. She pulled out her sat phone, hesitated. The last 2 calls had felt wrong. The voice had sounded wrong, the timing had been off. But she needed guidance, needed to know if she should intervene or let nature take its course. She dialed, waited. The connection took 30 seconds this time. When it finally came through, the voice was so broken by static she could barely understand it. Sir, she said, one subject has separated from the group. He's heading into bad terrain. Should I shadow him or let him go? Silence. Static, then words that came through in pieces. Let nature handle. No intervention. Ghost protocol. The call dropped. Morgan looked at the phone, looked at the screen that showed no signal, even though she had clear sky above her. Looked at the call log that showed 8 seconds of connection. She dialed again. Nothing. No connection, no satellite acquisition, no service. For the first time, real doubt crept in. She'd been calling this number for months, multiple times per day sometimes. The connection had always been clean, always immediate, always clear. Now it was breaking apart. Now it was failing. Now it was showing signs of being something other than what she thought it was. Morgan forced the doubt down, focused on the immediate problem. Archer was still moving east, still getting more lost, still heading toward a section of her property where the terrain turned hostile and the margin for error disappeared. She made a decision. She would shadow him, keep him in sight. If he found his way out, fine. If he got in real trouble, she'd activate her emergency beacon and let search and rescue handle it. No direct contact, no breaking cover, just insurance. By 1200, Archer had slowed to a crawl. He was dehydrated, hypothermic, making decisions with a brain that was running on fumes. He stopped by a stream, drank without filtering, guaranteed himself intestinal problems if he survived long enough for them to matter. Morgan was 200 yards away, watching through her scope, when Archer did something she didn't expect. He pulled out his phone. No service, but phones had other functions. He opened the camera, started recording a video, talking to the camera like it was a person. His voice carried in the cold air. If anyone finds this, my name is Brett Archer. I'm lost in the Cascade Range, Oregon. I was with a hunting party. We were on private property. We shouldn't have been there. The woman who owns it, she hunted us, drove us out. I ran. I thought I could make it. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. Tell Jennifer I loved her. Tell my kids I tried. He stopped recording, put the phone in a waterproof bag, tucked it into his jacket. Then he kept walking. Morgan felt something crack inside her chest. This was real. This had consequences. This wasn't tactical exercise or psychological operation. This was a human being who was going to die because she'd scared him into running. She pulled out her sat phone, tried to dial, no signal, tried again, no signal, tried a third time, the phone wouldn't even power on. She was alone. No guidance, no backup, no voice in her head telling her what was right. Archer collapsed by a fallen log at 1400, sat down, leaned back, closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow. His lips were blue. He was going into the shutdown phase of hypothermia, where the body starts giving up, where warmth seems to come from nowhere, where dying feels like sleeping. Morgan stood from her position, made the choice, started moving toward him. She'd covered 50 yards when she heard boots behind her. Multiple sets, moving fast. She spun, hand going to her sidearm, and found herself facing 3 men with rifles raised. Thornton, Shaw, Nolan. They'd circled back, had tracked Archer's path, had found Morgan in the process. Don't move, Thornton said. His rifle was pointed center mass. Professional stance, combat grip. This wasn't intimidation. This was real. Morgan raised her hands slowly, kept them visible, calculated distances and cover and odds. 3 on 1, all armed, all within 20 feet. No good options. You're Morgan Hale, Thornton said. Not a question, a statement. I am. You've been hunting us. I've been defending my property. You were warned. Multiple times. You chose to stay. Archer is dying, Shaw said. Because of you. Because you scared him into running. Archer is dying because he made bad choices. Just like all of you made bad choices. I gave you 243 days to make different ones. Nolan's rifle was shaking. You're not walking away from this. You're coming with us. We're taking you to the sheriff. Pressing charges. For what? Morgan said. Defending my land, protecting my property, everything I did was legal. Thornton took a step closer. Legal or not, you terrorized us, violated our privacy, drove a man to his death. He's not dead yet, Morgan said. He's right over there, 200 yards. If we go now, we can save him. Why should we trust you? Because I activated my emergency beacon 15 minutes ago. Morgan pulled the device from her pack, held it up. This transmits to search and rescue. They're already inbound. It was partly true. She'd pulled the beacon, hadn't activated it yet, but the bluff might buy time. Thornton looked at the beacon, looked at Morgan, looked at his men. The calculation played across his face. Believe her and maybe save Archer. Don't believe her and definitely lose him. Shaw, he said, go check on Archer now. Shaw lowered his rifle, ran toward where Morgan had indicated. Nolan kept his rifle on Morgan, hands still shaking, fear and anger mixing into something volatile. Thornton stepped closer. Within 10 feet now, close enough to see the details of her face, the scars on her hands, the way she stood with weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone bigger, meaner, more obvious. I learned from the best. Who taught you? Morgan hesitated, thought about Brennan, thought about the phone calls that had been getting stranger, thought about the voice that had been getting further away. Someone who isn't here anymore, she said finally. Shaw's voice carried from the trees. He's alive, barely. We need to move him now. Thornton looked at Morgan, looked at Nolan, made a decision. Lower your weapon. Boss, Nolan said, she's dangerous. Lower it. We're getting Archer out. Then we're having a conversation, all of us. The rifle came down. Morgan lowered her hands. For a moment, the three of them stood in the forest, enemy and enemy, threat and threat, both sides armed and neither side shooting. Then they went to save Brett Archer together, and in that moment, everything Morgan thought she understood about boundaries and consequences and right and wrong began to shift in ways she couldn't control and didn't know how to stop. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks. Temperature was falling. And somewhere in Morgan's pack, a sat phone that should have worked was silent and dark and dead, just like the man whose voice she'd been hearing. The man who died in Iraq 1 year ago. The man whose lessons lived in her head, even though he didn't live anywhere else. Colonel Marcus Brennan had been gone since 2024. Morgan knew this, had known it all along. Had chosen to pretend otherwise because hearing his voice, even if it was only her own voice pretending to be his, was easier than accepting that she was alone. The phone calls had never been real. The guidance had never been external. Every conversation had been Morgan talking to herself, channeling the training Brennan had given her, pretending he was still there to approve or disapprove or advise. The Wolf Protocol, the rules, the warnings, all of it had come from her. All of it had been her trying to do what she thought he would want, what she thought he would approve of. And now she stood in a forest with 3 armed men who'd hunted her while she was trying to save the man she'd terrorized into running, and the voice in her head that sounded like Brennan was silent. Because ghosts don't speak, they just haunt. And Morgan Hale had been haunted for longer than she'd admitted to herself. Shaw had Archer over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, moving toward the road with the determined pace of someone who'd done rescues before. Thornton walked beside Morgan, rifle lowered but ready. Nolan brought up the rear, still scared, still uncertain, still pointing his weapon at Morgan's back. We're not done here, Thornton said. When Archer is safe, when search and rescue has him, you and I are having a conversation about consequences. Looking forward to it, Morgan said. But her mind was elsewhere, on phone calls that had never happened, on voices that had never spoken, on truth she'd been avoiding for too long. The boundary line was still 8 miles away. The end was still coming, but the story had changed shape. The hunter had been caught. The ghost had become flesh. And the woman who'd thought she was enforcing justice was starting to realize she might have crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The mountains kept at her silence. The unnamed river kept talking to stone. And Morgan Hale kept walking toward whatever came next, knowing that the hardest part wasn't the operation. It was living with it after. The sound of helicopter rotors came from the west at 15-20 hours, cutting through mountain silence with mechanical urgency that didn't belong in wilderness. Morgan heard them first, years of training making her ears sharp for things that didn't match the natural soundscape. She was 50 yards ahead of the group, moving point, leading Thornton and Nolan and Shaw toward the logging road where Brett Archer's life was measured in minutes rather than hours. Shaw carried Brett in a fireman's carry, the younger man's weight distributed across shoulders that had carried deer and elk but never dying friends. Brett's breathing was shallow, his lips blue, his skin the color of old paper. Hypothermia had progressed past the point where field treatment mattered. He needed core warming, needed IV fluids, needed interventions that only came with ambulances and emergency rooms and doctors who'd trained for years to fight death and sometimes won. The helicopter settled into a clearing 200 yards from their position, rotors beating air into submission, downdraft flattening grass and sending pine needles into spirals. It was medical, not military. Civilian markings, search and rescue configuration. Someone had activated an emergency beacon. Morgan had pulled hers but not yet triggered it, which meant someone else had called for help. Two paramedics jumped out before the skids fully settled, moving fast with equipment that spoke to experience. They reached the group at a run, took one look at Brett, started working with the efficiency of people who'd seen hypothermia before and knew the protocols. Core temp, the first paramedic said, pressing a digital thermometer against Brett's neck. 89.2, his partner responded. Severe, we need to move now. They had Brett on a stretcher in 40 seconds, had him wrapped in thermal blankets in another 20, had him loaded and secured in under 2 minutes. Professional, fast, the kind of response that saved lives when lives could still be saved. Morgan watched from a distance, standing apart from the three men who'd hunted her and caught her, and now stood beside her in an alliance born from crisis. Thornton had his rifle slung, no longer pointing it at anything. Nolan had stopped shaking. Shaw stood with blood on his jacket from where Brett's nose had bled during the carry, staring at the helicopter like it might have answers. The lead paramedic jumped out, approached the group. Who activated the beacon? No one spoke. Morgan considered claiming it, considered the lie that would simplify everything, considered the truth that would complicate it. I did, Thornton said it finally. About half an hour ago, when we realized how bad he was. Good call, the paramedic said. Another hour and we'd be recovering a body instead of treating a patient. He looked at the four of them, at Morgan standing separate, at the dynamic that didn't quite make sense. You all together. It's complicated, Thornton said. The paramedic nodded like he'd heard that before. We're taking him to Cascade Medical in Bend. Our flight. You're his emergency contact. His parents are, Thornton said. Henry and Sarah Archer. Boise, Idaho. I can give you the number. The information was exchanged. The helicopter spooled up. Within 3 minutes of landing, it was gone, taking Brett Archer toward help that might arrive too late, leaving four people standing in a clearing, trying to figure out what came next. The silence after the rotors faded was profound. Morgan could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Nolan breathing too fast, could hear Shaw's boots shift on ground that had frozen overnight and thawed during the day and would freeze again tonight. Now what? Nolan said. Now we wait for the second helicopter, Morgan said quietly. What second helicopter? Shaw asked. The one that's been circling at distance for the last 10 minutes. Morgan pointed north. Federal Rangers, emergency beacon transmission would have alerted them too. They're trying to decide if this is a medical emergency or something else. As if summoned by her words, the second helicopter came into view, larger than the medical bird. Government markings, Forest Service configuration. It circled once, twice, then landed in the same clearing. Downdraft stirring up dust and pine needles and the smell of aviation fuel. Two Rangers emerged, both armed, both moving with the careful awareness of law enforcement responding to a situation with unknowns. A woman, late 30s, Hispanic, with sergeant stripes and eyes that cataloged everything. A man, early 50s, white, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in mountains dealing with people who thought rules were suggestions. The woman approached first. Federal Rangers Martinez and Chen. We got an emergency beacon activation from this location. What's the situation? Thornton stepped forward, one man suffering severe hypothermia, just evacuated by medical helicopter. We were hunting party that got separated. He wandered off, got lost. We found him, called for help. Martinez looked at Morgan. And you are. Morgan Hale. I own this property. 960 acres. These men have been trespassing for 8 months. I filed multiple complaints with Sheriff's Office in Prospect. Today's incident occurred while they were on my land without permission. Chen pulled out a tablet, started taking notes. This is quite a situation. We're going to need statements from everyone. He looked at the group. Anyone armed? 3 rifles, Thornton said. Sidearms on myself and Shaw, all legally owned. Nevertheless, Martinez said, for everyone's safety during this investigation, we're going to need to secure those weapons temporarily. You'll get them back. The men looked at each other. The calculation was visible. Refuse and escalate. Comply and trust the process. Thornton made the decision. He unslung his rifle, cleared it with practiced motions, handed it over. The others followed. Within 2 minutes, Martinez had secured 4 rifles and 2 pistols in the helicopter's equipment locker. Now, Chen said, let's start from the beginning. Who wants to go first? The interviews took 2 hours. Chen took Thornton aside. Martinez took Morgan. The other 2 sat under supervision, waiting their turn. The sun dropped toward the western peaks. Temperature fell. The day was ending, and the reckoning was beginning. Martinez was professional, thorough. She recorded everything on a digital recorder that would become evidence in whatever came next. Tell me in your own words what happened here. Morgan went through it methodically. The 243 days of documented trespassing, the police reports that went nowhere, the escalating vandalism, the decision to defend her property through psychological means rather than violence, the Wolf Protocol, the audio devices, the equipment tampering, the photographs. She left nothing out, owned every action, justified nothing. When she finished, Martinez was quiet for a long moment. That's quite an operation. You have military training, Navy, 12 years, honorable discharge, specialized training. Morgan met her eyes. SEAL qualified, Bud/S class 347. Martinez's expression changed slightly. Respect mixed with wariness. That explains the tactical sophistication. But it doesn't make what you did legal. I defended my property within the bounds of law. No assault, no battery, no threats. Just making my land uninvitable to trespassers. Psychological warfare is a gray area in civilian law. So is 8 months of documented trespassing with no law enforcement response. They looked at each other. 2 women in professions dominated by men, both understanding that power came in different forms and rules bent different ways depending on who was applying them. The man who got hypothermia, Martinez said. Brett Archer, he ran because he was terrified. You caused that terror. I gave 243 days of warnings. I filed legal complaints. I posted signs. I documented everything. When none of that worked, I escalated. Morgan paused. Would you have done different if people were violating your home for 8 months and law enforcement couldn't help? Martinez didn't answer. She didn't have to. The answer was in her silence. Chen approached with Thornton. The 2 rangers conferred quietly, comparing notes. Then they faced the group. Here's where we are, Chen said. This is federal land-adjacent property. We have jurisdiction over certain violations. But the core issue is trespassing on private property, which is county jurisdiction. The hypothermia incident complicates things because there's potential liability on both sides. Meaning what? Nolan asked. Meaning Ms. Hale could press charges for trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. You could potentially press charges for emotional distress in creating a hazardous situation. Both sides have exposure. Both sides have defenses. Chen looked at Thornton, then at Morgan. Seems to me the smart play is to call this a wash. You leave her property. Don't come back. She doesn't pursue charges. You don't either. Everyone walks away, and we chalk this up to a territorial dispute that got out of hand. Thornton was quiet, thinking. Then he looked at Morgan. That acceptable to you? Depends, Morgan said. You planning to come back? Ever? For any reason? No. Thornton's voice was firm. We're done here. This land, this territory, everything. We're done. Then we're done, Morgan said. No charges, no lawsuits. Clean break. Martinez looked relieved. Smart choice. Both of you. She turned to the others. That goes for all of you. This ends here. Today. If we get called back to this property for any reason involving any of you, the charges will be federal and they won't be negotiable. The men nodded. Agreement without enthusiasm. Acceptance without joy. The kind of resolution that left everyone slightly dissatisfied but alive and free. We'll give you a lift back to your vehicles, Chen said. Then you're on your own. He looked at Morgan. You need transport. I'm good. My cabin is 2 hours walk from here. I know the terrain. The Rangers loaded the men into the helicopter. Before boarding, Thornton walked over to Morgan. Stood close enough for private conversation. Far enough for respect. I need to say something, he said. Go ahead. What you did, the tactics, the operation, it was professional, effective, brutal. He paused. We underestimated you. That was our mistake. Our arrogance. I'm sorry for that. For the trespassing, for the vandalism, for making you feel unsafe in your own home. Morgan looked at him. Really looked. Saw a man in his 50s who'd spent his life being strong and competent and in control, now admitting failure. It took something to do that, took character. Why'd you stay so long, she asked, after the first warnings, after the signs, after the police reports? Why keep coming back? Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Because I've spent my whole life going where I wanted, taking what I wanted, doing what I wanted. Money and skills and confidence made me think rules were for other people. He looked at the mountains. This land felt like it belonged to whoever was strong enough to claim it. I was wrong. Ownership isn't about strength, it's about responsibility. You have the deed, you have the right, we didn't. Morgan nodded, the apology was real. The understanding came late, but it came. The man you called Brennan, Thornton said. During your operation, you mentioned him to the Rangers, said he taught you. Who is he? Morgan felt something tighten in her chest. Was. Who he was. Colonel Marcus Brennan, Navy Special Warfare. He died last year. Iraq. Saving my life. But you were talking to him on the phone. I heard you. I was talking to a ghost, Morgan said quietly. PTSD does strange things. Makes you hear voices that aren't there. Makes you believe help is coming when you're really alone. She met Thornton's eyes. I've been alone this whole time. The person I thought was guiding me was just my own mind pretending someone still cared. Thornton looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been recognition. We're all alone in the ways that matter. Some of us just admit it sooner. The helicopter was spooling up. Thornton extended his hand. Morgan took it. The handshake was firm, brief, the kind that acknowledged what had happened without celebrating it. I hope your friend makes it, Morgan said. Brett, I hope he survives. Me too. Thornton released her hand. And I hope you find peace, real peace, not just silence. He walked to the helicopter and didn't look back. Within minutes, the bird was gone, taking with it the last physical connection to 243 days of conflict. Morgan stood alone in the clearing, listening to the rotors fade, feeling the weight of victory settle on shoulders that had carried heavier things but never felt quite this tired. She pulled out her sat phone, looked at it. The screen was dark. Dead battery or dead connection or dead something. She tried to power it on. Nothing happened. Just black glass reflecting her face back at her. It's over, she said to the phone. To Brennan, to herself, to whoever was listening or not listening in the vast indifference of mountains and sky. It's finally over. Then she started the long walk home. The call came 3 days later on her landline, the old copper wire connection that still worked when satellites didn't and cell towers were too far to matter. Morgan was on her porch, coffee in hand, watching dawn light paint the peaks in shades of gold that cameras couldn't capture. The voice on the other end was professional, clinical. This is Cascade Medical Center in Bend. We're calling about Brett Archer. You're listed as a contact on his emergency information. I'm not family, Morgan said. His parents should be primary contact. They've been notified. But Mr. Archer regained consciousness yesterday and asked that we call you specifically. He has something he wants to say. Is he going to make it? Pause. The kind that carried weight. He's stable now, but he was without adequate core warming for nearly 6 hours. There's organ damage. Kidney function is compromised. He'll need dialysis, possibly long-term. The prognosis is uncertain. Morgan closed her eyes, saw Brett running through the forest, panicked and alone, making decisions born from terror she'd created. Can I speak to him? Not yet. He's too weak. But he recorded a message, asked us to relay it. The voice paused. He said to tell you, I don't blame you. I made my choices. Tell my family I'm sorry. The call ended. Morgan sat on her porch steps, holding a phone that had gone silent, feeling the weight of consequences that didn't care about intentions or justifications or tactical success. Brett Archer would live, but he'd live damaged, diminished, forever marked by decisions made in panic during hours when fear overrode reason. She hadn't pulled a trigger, hadn't raised a hand, but she'd created the conditions that led to his running, and running had led to everything after. No killing, Brennan had said. You put a body on the ground, that's murder. But there were worse things than killing. There were half-deaths, permanent injuries, consequences that followed people home and lived in their bodies and reminded them every day of mistakes they couldn't undo. Morgan went inside, opened the drawer where the sat phone lived, pulled it out, looked at it, the device that had connected her to a voice that wasn't there, to guidance that was just her own training echoing back, to the ghost of a man who died saving her life while she'd gone on living. She pressed the power button, held it, waited. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. The phone was dead, battery or hardware or whatever made satellite connections possible, dead and not coming back. She walked to her workshop, found a hammer, took the phone outside, placed it on a flat rock, raised the hammer, brought it down. The screen shattered. The case cracked, circuits and components scattered. She hit it again and again and again until there was nothing left but fragments and the certainty that some connections needed to be broken permanently. When she was done, she swept the pieces into a bag, walked to the property line, buried them a foot deep under a pine tree that had been growing since before she was born and would keep growing after she was gone. 2 weeks passed. The forest settled back into patterns that predated human conflict and would continue after. Deer returned to trails they'd abandoned. Elk moved through meadows without fear. The unnamed river kept talking to stone in a language that needed no translation. Morgan fell back into routine. Morning run, pull-ups, coffee, property inspection. But the routine felt different now. Lighter. Like she'd been carrying something heavy without realizing it and had finally set it down. She was checking fence line on the eastern boundary when she saw the truck coming up her access road. Old Ford, civilian, moving slow, not threat, not flight, just approach. The truck stopped 50 yards from her cabin. 2 people got out. One was Keegan. The other was younger, early 20s, wearing Marine Corps utilities with corporal stripes and the look of someone who'd earned them the hard way. Morgan walked toward them, hand near her sidearm but not on it, aware but not alarmed. Keegan raised his hand in greeting. Ms. Hale, hope it's okay we came. Wanted to talk if you have time. The younger man stood straighter as Morgan approached. She could see the family resemblance. Same eyes, same jawline, same way of holding tension in the shoulders. This is my son, Keegan said. Connor. He's home on leave from Pendleton. Wanted to meet you. Connor extended his hand. Marine Corps taught you to respect warriors regardless of service branch. Ma'am, my father told me what happened. What you did. He paused. I wanted to say I understand why. Morgan took his hand. The grip was firm, professional. Do you? I'm deployed in 6 weeks. Middle East rotation. When I'm over there, I think about home, about what I'm protecting, about boundaries that matter. Connor looked at the mountains. If someone violated my family's home while I was gone, I'd want someone to defend it, the way you defended yours. Your father made the right choice, Morgan said. He left when he had the chance. That took more courage than staying. Keegan stepped forward. I wanted to apologize. Face to face. No rangers, no lawyers, just one person to another. What we did was wrong. The trespassing, the vandalism, the disrespect. He pulled something from his pocket. Your dog tags. I kept them. Figured you'd want them back. Morgan took the tags, felt the worn metal, read her own name stamped in letters that had been sharp once and were rounded now by time. Thank you. Brett is out of the hospital, Keegan said. He's with his parents in Boise. Dialysis 3 times a week. Doctors say maybe his kidneys will recover. Maybe not. He wanted me to tell you he's not pressing charges, not holding grudges, just trying to get better. Morgan nodded. Tell him I'm glad he's alive. There was silence. The kind that holds weight but not discomfort. 3 people who'd been on opposite sides of something, now standing together in sunlight that didn't care about conflict or resolution. Connor looked around at the property, at the fence line, at the mountains beyond. It's beautiful here. Worth defending. It is, Morgan said. Worth everything I did, worth everything it cost. Keegan pulled one more thing from his pocket. Photo, his family, wife who'd passed, Connor in dress blues, himself younger and less weathered. We live 40 miles east, town called Sisters. If you're ever out that way, if you need anything, neighbors help neighbors. Morgan took the photo, looked at 3 faces that represented what she'd been fighting for. Family, home, belonging, the things that made boundaries matter. I'll remember that, she said. They left shortly after, drove down the access road and disappeared into forest that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. Morgan stood in her yard, holding dog tags in one hand and a photo in the other, feeling something shift inside her chest. She'd spent 12 years in the Navy protecting strangers in countries she'd never see again, enforcing boundaries that politicians drew on maps. She'd lost friends, lost mentors, lost parts of herself that she'd never get back. But here on 960 acres of Oregon wilderness, she'd defended something that belonged to her, had enforced a boundary that meant something personal, had made people understand that lines on maps were backed by real consequences. It had cost, had scarred, had revealed truths about herself she'd been avoiding. But it had also worked. Inside her cabin, she walked to the mantle where the old photograph lived. 8-year-old version of herself. Father in Army uniform. Brennan in Navy dress blues. All of them smiling at futures they couldn't see and didn't know were limited. She picked up the frame, looked at Brennan's face. Young and certain and alive. Thank you, she said to the image, for everything you taught me. For raising me when you didn't have to. For dying so I could live. She paused. I'm letting you go now. Not forgetting. Just letting go. She set the frame down, walked to her laptop, Opened the file where she kept records of the operation. 243 days of surveillance, audio recordings, photographs, documentation of every violation and every response. She selected all, moved to trash, emptied trash, secure delete, 7 pass overwrite. When the process finished, the only evidence that existed was in memory, and memory could be managed. The chapter was closed. The boundary was enforced. The ghost was released. 1 month later, Morgan was walking her fence line at dawn, routine restored, peace settled into patterns that felt sustainable. She stopped to check a marker post, bent down to examine the base, saw the boot print. Fresh, maybe 12 hours old, men's size 11, not tactical this time, hiking boot, deep tread, heavy stride. She photographed it from 3 angles, measured, documented. Then she looked up at the tree line, scanning for movement that she knew she wouldn't see. On a ridge, 800 yards distant, too far for civilian optics but clear in military-grade glass, a figure watched through a scope. The figure wore civilian clothes. Carried no visible weapons. Could have been a hiker. Could have been could have been anything. The figure lowered the scope, pulled out a radio, keyed the mic. Target confirmed. Hail Morgan. Assessment. Formidable. Recommend observation only. Do not engage. The radio crackled back. Acknowledged. Continue surveillance. Report daily. The figure raised the scope again. Watched Morgan examine the boot print. Watched her stand and scan the tree line. Watched her make the decision to document rather than pursue. Professional, the figure said quietly. Disciplined. Exactly what the file said she'd be. Morgan stood at her fence line, looking up at ridges that held secrets, feeling the familiar weight of awareness that came from knowing you were being watched. She'd felt it for 243 days while watching others. Now she felt it watching her. She pulled out her notebook, wrote carefully. Day 1, new violation, single operator, professional grade surveillance, pattern unknown, intent unknown. She closed the notebook, looked up at the mountains one more time. Whoever was out there, they'd made a choice. They'd crossed her fence line. Not physically, maybe, but observation was violation when the observation was uninvited. This time I'm ready, she said to the wind, to the mountains, to whoever was listening through glass and distance. She walked back to her cabin, put the M40A6 rifle by the door where it could be grabbed quickly, checked her ammunition supply, made sure her emergency beacon was charged, prepared for what came next. Because boundaries were never truly secure. Peace was never truly permanent. The fence line was just a line until someone tested it, and someone always tested it eventually. The mountain kept its secrets. The river kept talking to stone. And Morgan Hale kept walking the perimeter of land she'd bought with money earned in blood. Land she'd defended with tactics learned from ghosts. Land she'd hold until someone strong enough to take it appeared. That someone might be watching from the ridge, might be planning, might be calculating odds and angles and approaches. Morgan almost hoped they were, because defending the boundary wasn't a burden anymore. It was purpose, it was identity. It was the thing that made her get up at 0500 and run the fence line and count the boot prints and document the violations. She'd been a warrior for 12 years in uniform. Now she was a warrior in different territory, fighting different battles, but still fighting. The dog tags hung on a hook by her door. Not buried, not hidden, not denied. Hail MUSN. Evidence of who she'd been, reminder of what she'd learned, promise of what she'd defend. The sat phone was gone. Brennan's voice was silent. The hallucination was recognized and released. But the training remained. The discipline endured. The lessons lived in muscle memory and neural pathways carved deep by repetition and consequence. Some boundaries were marked with fence posts and signs. Some were marked with consequences and fear. Some were marked with respect earned through demonstration of capability. Morgan had marked hers with all 3. And now she stood on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun paint mountains in colors that changed every morning and never repeated, knowing that peace was temporary and conflict was cyclical, and the only thing that mattered was being ready when it came. Somewhere on that distant ridge, someone watched through glass, took notes, made assessments, reported to whoever sent them. Let them watch, Morgan thought. Let them assess. Let them report. The last fence held. It would hold tomorrow. It would hold next month. It would hold as long as Morgan Hale was alive to defend it. And defending it was what she did best. The forest kept its silence. The boundary held its line. And in a small cabin at the highest defensible point on 960 acres of Oregon wilderness, a woman who'd survived war and loss and ghosts and guilt made fresh coffee and started another day of walking the perimeter. Because some things were worth defending. Some boundaries mattered. Some lines couldn't be crossed without cost. And Morgan Hale had become the cost, the consequence, the enforcer of rules that existed whether people acknowledged them or not. The mountains had witnessed, the river had spoken, the boundary had held, and it would hold tomorrow. The end of one story, the beginning of another. The cycle that defined life on the edge of wilderness, where human law met natural consequence, and the strong survived by knowing when to fight and when to let the land fight for them. Morgan Hale knew both, had proven both, would do both again if tested. And she would be tested. The blueprint promised that. The watcher on the ridge confirmed it. The cycle demanded it. But for now, this morning, this moment, the coffee was hot and the sun was rising and the fence line held, and that was enough. That was victory. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. And real was all that mattered. I've told hundreds of military stories, but Morgan Hale's situation hits different. She did everything right. Legal warnings, police reports, 243 days of patience. When the system failed her, she didn't break the law. She just reminded 5 men why Navy SEALs are trained in more than marksmanship. Here's what keeps me up at night. Brett Archer survived, but he'll need dialysis for life. Was that justice? Was it proportional? Or did fear push him into terrain that killed him as surely as a bullet? What would you have done in her position? And more importantly, what would you have done in theirs after seeing those photographs? Drop your thoughts below. And if you served, I want to hear how you handled boundaries when the rulebook failed.